The scorching flames erupted without warning across the volcanic wasteland. Japanese soldiers had never seen anything like it before. 400 feet of liquid fire streamed through the morning air. The weapon they never expected was about to change everything. These weren't the tanks they had prepared to fight. Hidden beneath what looked like ordinary Sherman armor lay something revolutionary. American engineers had created instruments of terror that would shatter the strongest defenses on Iwo Jima. The volcanic rock had seemed like perfect protection. 11 miles of interconnected tunnels snaked through the island's core. Hundreds of concrete bunkers dotted the landscape. An entire year of fortification work had created what Japanese commanders believed was an impregnable fortress. 8 square miles of death traps waited for the Americans, or so they thought. What lurked just offshore would prove them catastrophically wrong. Morning darkness still covered the beaches on February 19, 1945. Pre-dawn silence masked the approaching storm. Japanese defenders crouched in their reinforced positions. They watched the horizon through narrow observation slits. American landing ships waited in the distance. Traditional Sherman tanks lined up in the assault waves. Artillery pieces prepared for the bombardment. Everything appeared normal to enemy eyes. But 8 tanks in that fleet carried something extraordinary. Something the Japanese had never encountered. Something their intelligence networks had never reported. The secret weapon remained perfectly disguised. American forces had learned bitter lessons across the Pacific. Every island had told the same brutal story. Japanese defenders had mastered the art of fortification. Their bunker systems resisted conventional weapons with terrifying effectiveness. Artillery bombardments proved inadequate. Naval gunfire couldn't penetrate deep enough. Tank shells bounced off reinforced concrete. Traditional weapons had reached their limits against sophisticated defensive networks. Tarawa in November 1943 had demonstrated the problem clearly. 76 hours of continuous bombardment had barely scratched Japanese defenses. Defenders emerged from their bunkers to inflict devastating casualties. The lesson burned itself into American tactical thinking. Something revolutionary was needed. Something the Japanese couldn't anticipate or counter. American ingenuity was about to provide the answer. Military engineers had been working in secret facilities across Hawaii. Colonel Unmacht of the Army Chemical Warfare Service led the development program. His top-secret flamethrower group at Schofield Barracks became the birthplace of liquid fire warfare. Navy Seabees from the 117th Construction Battalion joined the project. Together they began converting ordinary tanks into weapons of nightmare. The early attempts used light tanks with Canadian-built Ronson flamethrowers. These earned the nickname Satan tanks. The Marianas Campaign saw the first combat use of flame tanks. Their psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immediate and profound. But larger tanks with better protection were clearly needed for future operations. The breakthrough came with M4A3 Sherman medium tanks. These conversions became the CBH-1 and later the improved CBH-2 models. Each conversion required massive amounts of work and resources. 150 pounds of welding rod went into every tank. 1,100 electrical connections linked the complex systems. The cost reached between $20,000 and $25,000 per vehicle. That represented nearly $300,000 in modern money. The result justified every penny spent. These weapons could project flaming napalm up to 400 feet. 300 pounds per square inch of pressure drove the liquid fire through the air. The flamethrower could traverse 270 degrees without moving the tank. Most importantly, the weapon operated from within Sherman armor protection. Japanese anti-tank weapons could barely scratch the thick steel plating. The flamethrower crews remained safe while delivering devastation. American forces developed revolutionary tactics around these weapons. The corkscrew and blowtorch method became standard procedure. Regular Sherman tanks would crack open Japanese bunkers with 75mm shells. Flamethrower tanks would follow up by dousing the interior with burning fuel. This combination proved devastatingly effective against even the most determined defenders. No position could withstand the coordinated assault. No bunker provided adequate protection against liquid fire. The program received the highest military priority by 1944. June 1945 brought AAA procurement classification. The flamethrower tanks now shared priority status with the B-29 bomber program and atomic bomb development. Military leadership understood they had created something extraordinary. The weapon would change the nature of Pacific warfare. But Japanese intelligence remained completely unaware of these developments. Their intelligence network was increasingly strained as American forces advanced. Information about new American weapon systems rarely reached defensive planners. Japanese commanders prepared their defenses based on previous encounters with conventional tanks and weapons. Anti-tank tactics focused on mobility and concealment. Shaped charges and suicide attacks had proven effective against traditional armored vehicles. Japanese doctrine called for allowing enemy tanks to advance into prepared kill zones. They had developed sophisticated countermeasures against regular Sherman tanks. 47mm anti-tank guns could penetrate Sherman armor under the right conditions. Mines and hand-delivered explosive charges by suicide squads had destroyed numerous American tanks in previous battles. All of these tactics assumed conventional tank warfare. Japanese defenders had no way of knowing that American tanks were about to arrive with 400-foot flame projectors. Their tunnel systems, designed as refugees, would become death traps filled with burning fuel and smoke. Intelligence reports from previous battles had told Japanese commanders what to expect. Sherman armor thickness was well documented. The penetrating power of 75mm guns was clearly understood. American tactical doctrines had been studied and analyzed, but nowhere in their files was any mention of tanks that could breathe fire. The weapon that would prove most effective against their defenses remained completely unknown. This information gap would prove catastrophic. Operation detachment preparations proceeded under strictest secrecy. The 8 converted Sherman flamethrower tanks were loaded aboard landing craft alongside regular equipment. To Japanese observers, they appeared identical to standard Sherman tanks. The flamethrower was perfectly disguised within what looked like a normal 75mm gun barrel. Only when these tanks opened fire would Japanese defenders discover what they were truly facing. The surprise would be complete and terrifying. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima. He had prepared for a siege of unprecedented intensity. Ammunition stockpiles filled underground storage areas. Minefields channeled American armor into carefully prepared killing zones. The best tank hunting teams waited in concealed positions throughout the island. They had studied American tactics from previous battles extensively. They believed they understood enemy capabilities completely. General Kuribayashi himself was uniquely qualified to assess American military technology. He had served as military attaché in the United States before the war. His understanding of American industrial capacity and tactical thinking exceeded that of most Japanese commanders. Even his extensive knowledge of American capabilities hadn't prepared him for what was coming. The weapon his troops were about to encounter existed beyond their intelligence estimates. No contingency plans addressed tanks that could project fire deep into tunnels and bunkers. Japanese defensive planning for Iwo Jima called for fighting withdrawal from prepared positions. The island's complex tunnel system would maintain resistance even after surface positions were overrun. They had learned from previous battles that banzai charges were wasteful and ineffective. Instead, they would make Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. Their fortifications would maximize the cost of victory through careful defensive positioning. Every position was designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. These preparations assumed familiar weapons and conventional tactics. Japanese planners had no countermeasures for tanks that could turn their strongest positions into furnaces. They were preparing to fight the previous war, while warfare itself was about to evolve. Pre-dawn hours brought the first American landing craft toward Iwo Jima's beaches. The 8 flamethrower tanks remained hidden among conventional armor. Japanese observers counted tanks and estimated American strength based on visual reconnaissance. They had no indication that 8 of those Sherman tanks carried weapons that would fundamentally alter the battle. The secret remained perfectly preserved until the moment of first contact. Initial landings proceeded exactly as Japanese commanders expected. American Marines fought their way off the beaches against determined resistance. Conventional tanks provided support with high explosive and armor-piercing rounds fired from standard guns. Japanese anti-tank teams prepared their weapons with confidence born from previous victories. Their tactics had proven effective in earlier island battles. They assumed this engagement would follow familiar patterns. But they were about to discover that this battle would be unlike anything they had experienced. Revolutionary weapons waited in reserve for the critical moment. The nature of warfare was about to change forever. The second day of battle brought the order for special weapons deployment. The 8 flamethrower tanks, which had been carefully held in reserve, were finally called into action. What happened next would shock Japanese defenders to their core. Decades of military experience had not prepared them for weapons that could reach deep into their most protected positions. The psychological impact would be immediate and devastating. Veterans of years of warfare would find themselves facing something beyond their training and experience. The secret weapon that Japanese troops never knew existed was about to reveal itself in jets of liquid fire. The age of conventional tank warfare was ending. Something far more terrifying and effective was taking its place. February 21, 1945, marked the moment of truth for both armies. Marine Corporal James Patterson crouched behind a shell crater, watching what appeared to be an ordinary Sherman tank approach, a heavily fortified Japanese bunker complex. 2 days of conventional weapons had failed to dislodge the defenders from these positions. Artillery barrages had merely chipped the concrete. Naval gunfire had done little more than create dust clouds. Direct hits from tank cannons had failed to penetrate the sophisticated construction. The Japanese position seemed impregnable. Inside the bunker, Japanese machine gunners prepared for another assault. They had successfully repelled multiple attacks with confidence born from their fortress-like position. The volcanic rock provided perfect protection from conventional weapons. Lieutenant Yamamoto adjusted his heavy machine gun position, watching through the narrow firing port. The American tank approached within his engagement range. He had destroyed tanks before using proven tactics and techniques. The Sherman came within range and stopped in the familiar pre-firing position. Yamamoto prepared for the crack of a 75mm cannon. Instead, something unprecedented happened that changed the nature of warfare forever. A stream of liquid fire erupted from what had appeared to be the tank's main gun. Burning napalm arced through the air like a comet of death. The flame reached across distances no infantry flamethrower could ever achieve. It poured directly through the bunker's firing port with devastating accuracy. The effect was immediate and absolutely terrifying. Within seconds, the interior of the bunker became a roaring inferno. Temperatures soared to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The carefully prepared defensive position became a death trap with no possibility of escape. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese defenders abandoned their positions en masse. They fled from caves and bunkers they had sworn to defend to the death. The psychological impact shattered their most fundamental assumptions about defensive warfare. Marine Captain Frank Caldwell commanded the 26th Marines during this engagement. He witnessed the revolutionary moment and later documented its significance. The flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, won this battle. It was the one weapon that caused Japanese defenders to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. What Japanese defenders experienced that day exceeded anything their training had prepared them to handle. The flamethrower attacks, nicknamed Zippo and Ronson by American forces, had finally revealed their devastating secret. Operating on 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, these weapons projected streams of thickened gasoline up to 400 feet. Unlike portable flamethrowers with limited range and exposed operators, these armored weapons engaged targets from relative safety. They carried enough fuel for sustained operations throughout extended battles. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immediate and profound beyond anything previously witnessed. Historical accounts describe troops surrendering or fleeing upon seeing flame tanks fire ranging shots. They refused to risk being burned alive in their defensive positions. Veterans of years of warfare, who had faced artillery bombardments and conventional tank assaults without breaking, found themselves confronting something that challenged their most basic assumptions. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura was a veteran of the China campaign and multiple island battles. His post-war testimony described his first encounter with American flame tanks in vivid detail. "We had trained extensively against tanks. We knew their weapons and tactics intimately. But when that fire came through our firing ports, reaching places we thought were safe, it was like fighting demons rather than men. The flame followed us into our tunnels. There was nowhere to hide from the burning death." Tactical doctrine that Japanese forces had developed for tank warfare proved completely inadequate. Japanese commanders had specifically instructed their troops on careful selection of attack points for close-quarter assaults on American armor. Their countermeasures assumed conventional flamethrowers with limited range and fuel capacity. The reality was shockingly different from their intelligence estimates. Sherman-mounted flamethrowers could engage targets at distances that made traditional tank hunting tactics suicidal. Japanese soldiers attempting to approach with satchel charges or magnetic mines found themselves under fire long before reaching their targets. The protective armor of the Sherman made the tanks nearly invulnerable to small arms fire. Their flamethrowers could clear defending positions with devastating effectiveness that no previous weapon had achieved. American forces quickly adapted their tactics to maximize psychological impact. The corkscrew and blowtorch method became standard operating procedure. Regular Sherman tanks engaged Japanese positions with high-explosive shells first. These conventional attacks created openings in bunker walls and defensive structures. Flamethrower tanks then moved forward to pump burning napalm through these openings. This ensured that no defenders could remain in position. The effectiveness of this combined arms approach was remarkable and unprecedented. Positions that had required days of fighting to capture could now be cleared in hours. Japanese defenders who had shown extraordinary courage when facing conventional weapons found themselves psychologically broken. The weapon they had never known existed was rewriting all the rules of Pacific warfare. Its impact extended far beyond individual tactical engagements. By the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, the 8 flamethrower tanks were consuming approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm every single day. The fuel consumption alone testified to the intensive use of these weapons and their critical importance in overcoming resistance. What had begun as an experimental weapon had become absolutely essential to American tactical success. The psychological warfare aspect proved as important as the physical destruction capability. Japanese military intelligence, already struggling with communication difficulties, began receiving reports of American fire tanks that defied previous understanding. These reports filtered back to defensive planners on other islands throughout the Pacific. But the damage was already done to their strategic assumptions. Fortifications designed to resist conventional weapons were inadequate against these new threats that could reach anywhere. Okinawa saw the largest deployment of flamethrower tanks in the entire Pacific War. The 713th Tank Battalion consumed 200,000 gallons of napalm during the campaign. This testified to the scale and intensity of flame tank operations against Japanese positions. Defenders found that their most carefully prepared positions could be neutralized by weapons they had never encountered before. The human cost of this technological surprise was enormous, both physically and psychologically. Japanese casualties from flamethrower attacks weren't just physical, but mental. Survivors described the terror of facing weapons that could reach into the deepest bunkers and most protected positions throughout their defensive networks. The flame tanks had changed more than just tactics. They had changed the fundamental nature of defensive warfare itself. But the story reveals more than technological innovation alone. It demonstrates how rapidly military technology evolved during World War II. Information gaps could prove decisive in determining combat outcomes. The Japanese military, despite its intelligence capabilities and extensive combat experience, had failed to anticipate this revolutionary development. Defensive strategies based on previous encounters with American forces proved inadequate when facing weapons they had never known existed. Their intelligence failure had catastrophic consequences for their defensive capabilities. The flame tank development showcased American industrial and technological adaptability under wartime pressure. Colonel Unmacht's flame tank group ultimately produced 354 converted tanks. This represented a massive commitment of resources and technical expertise. The program received the same priority as the atomic bomb project. This demonstrated how seriously American military leadership took the challenge of overcoming Japanese fortifications throughout the Pacific theater. For individual Japanese soldiers, the encounter with flame tanks was often their first indication of extensive American technological capabilities. Many had been told that American forces relied primarily on material superiority rather than fighting skill. The flame tanks seemed to confirm this assessment in the most terrifying way possible. They represented not just superior equipment, but weapons that fundamentally changed combat itself. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be understated in its importance. The mere appearance of these tanks was often enough to cause Japanese defenders to abandon positions without firing a shot. The reputation of flame tanks spread faster than the weapons themselves. This created psychological impact that extended far beyond their actual deployment numbers. The success highlighted the importance of combined arms tactics in modern warfare. The tanks were most effective when coordinated with infantry artillery and conventional armor units. American forces developed sophisticated procedures for coordinating these different weapon systems. This maximized their collective impact while minimizing casualties among their own troops. The technological surprise represented by flame tanks would not be repeated as the war progressed. Japanese intelligence eventually gathered information about American capabilities. Defensive measures began to evolve accordingly. But by then, the strategic initiative had shifted decisively toward American forces. The psychological impact had already achieved its intended effect throughout the Pacific theater. The legacy extended well beyond the conflict itself. They represented a revolution in military technology demonstrating how rapidly new weapons could be developed, tested, and deployed under wartime conditions. Collaboration between Navy Seabees, Army specialists, and Marine Corps tactical units showed how different military branches could work together. Complex battlefield challenges required coordinated solutions across service boundaries. For Japanese defenders who survived encounters with flame tanks, the experience remained traumatic decades after the war ended. Many spoke of how the weapons had shattered their confidence in prepared defensive positions. Their understanding of combat itself had been fundamentally altered. They had been prepared to face death in battle. But they weren't prepared to confront weapons that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. The flame tanks proved that technological surprise could be as decisive as numerical superiority or strategic planning. Japanese forces, despite their courage training and determination, found themselves facing weapons for which they had no adequate response. The tanks they never knew existed had become their most feared enemy. They changed the course of individual battles and ultimately contributed to ending the Pacific War. In the broader context of military history, American flamethrower tanks represent a unique moment when technological innovation created decisive battlefield advantage. They demonstrate how quickly warfare can change when revolutionary weapons are introduced. Psychological factors proved as important as physical capabilities in determining battle outcomes. Japanese troops learned in the most direct and terrifying way that they were fighting an enemy whose technological capabilities far exceeded intelligence estimates. The tanks they never knew existed had proven that in modern warfare, knowledge truly was power. Ignorance about enemy capabilities could prove fatal to defensive planning. The age of the flame tank was brief but decisive in its impact. It left an indelible mark on Pacific War history, and the memory of all who witnessed their terrible effectiveness against even the strongest positions.